Hi, I'm Pastor Denis Plant, and I'm about to start presenting a series to you on my favourite topic, the blood covenant of God. Why the blood covenant? Well, there's a lot of reasons for studying blood covenant, chief of which is the fact that over the years, blood covenant is a subject which has been lost in our Bible colleges and in our churches, and yet this is a subject which has more impact on our lives and is found more frequently throughout the Bible than any other topic. You will find blood covenant in every book of the Bible. You will find it in almost every chapter, on almost every page of the Bible. There are statements, illustrations, direct references, allusions, and so on and so forth to blood covenant throughout the Bible. It is incredibly important for you and for me to get to know blood covenant, because it is God's binding covenant with us. Now, before we get too far into that, I need to make something clear about this particular session. It is mostly going to be something of a history lesson, so I hope you'll enjoy history and get to understand the background behind this. Blood covenant isn't simply a biblical concept. It is a biblical concept. It is also a secular concept. That is one of the reasons why it is so important. Since the early 1900s, the idea of blood covenant has been brushed from society, written out of our colloquial language, and we've lost its meaning. What I hope to do in this series is bring back to life the power, the force, the glory, if you like, of what a blood covenant is for you and for me. So let's take some time to find out what is a blood covenant and what it is all about. It is important to realize that from ancient times until our most recent past, a blood covenant was the most binding form of agreement that there was between two particular peoples. More than any other form of agreement, it had been responsible for the establishment of and maintaining of peace between warring nations, tribes, families, and so on and so forth. A blood covenant was able to provide a means of formalizing an existing peaceful relationship and the development of alliances between peoples and nations around the world. It's something which we cannot fail to understand as we get into this subject. This is so important to you and so relevant. It is interesting that almost every nation on earth, if not every nation on earth, has its own form of formal relationship and agreements between different kinds of people. Those relationships, those agreements take many different kinds of forms. It might be an agreement, a compact, a covenant, a guarantee. Lots of different names are given. But the fascinating thing is that the closer we get to a blood covenant, what we find is that the more similar these agreements or these ceremonies are and the laws are concerning blood covenant. It is as though at some time in our past there was a single blood covenant, and upon that blood covenant all of the blood covenants were built. Yes, there are cultural differences and cultural styles that make variations to the blood covenant ceremonies itself, but nonetheless, the bones of it are almost identical, no matter where you go, no matter which nation you go to, no matter what time in our ancient histories we might seek out. The reasons for the success of blood covenant was that it was a totally binding agreement on both of the families. It had an absolute agreement. Both of the parties had to be willing to enter into this agreement, and the laws that were applied equally to both sides, regardless of the kind of blood covenant that was entered into. It was equally binding on both parties. Now, it wasn't just binding on those that entered into the blood covenant. It was binding on their families or their peoples, their tribes, whatever it might be. And it was to remain in existence as long as a single member of the family were to live. The blood covenant would continue on as an unbroken agreement between them. And there are many examples throughout history of this being the case. It's an interesting thing when you think about this, though, that between two tribes, it is quite possible that over hundreds of years that two tribes or nations could actually disappear. Certainly it's true of families, but when it comes to nations, it's not possible. Now, when it comes to dealing with a blood covenant between God and man, and this same principle applies, as long as God exists, and as long as there is a human being alive on earth, the blood covenant of God must continue to exist in all of its force. Now, there are two reasons for cutting a blood covenant, and they brought about two different named blood covenants. Now, it's important to make that point to us, because although there are two named differences in these blood covenants, the fact remains that the covenants themselves remain identical. There's no real difference between the blood covenants in themselves, except in the manner in which they begin. But let's have a quick look at these two principles for which a blood covenant would start. One would be a stronger, more powerful nation is bent on territorial expansion and would conquer a smaller nation and offer a blood covenant treaty as an alternative to destroying them. So what would happen is that the king, who's going to be referred to as a great king, the conquering king, is going to come up to a smaller nation, and just before he's ready to annihilate them, he would send an emissary and say, look, here's the choice. You can either enter into a blood covenant with me and be my vassal, and you can live. Now, being a vassal covenant meant that he could remain the king of his nation, with all of the rights and all of the responsibilities that belong to a king, but he himself is going to be subject to the conquering king. Now, this is the kind of blood covenant that you and I are going to have entered into with God. But the second kind of blood covenant was between two kings of similar strength and power. They would agree to come together for the benefit of each party, that they realize that a battle between them is only going to be expensive in both money and in human cost, and so sooner or later they would come to an agreement. It's going to be on this brother covenant. This is called a brother covenant, and we're going to be looking at the ceremony of a brother covenant as we go through this, even though the ceremony is exactly the same as it is for both of the covenants. We're so grateful that archaeology has discovered some fascinating and interesting facts for us, and we can lean on these as we turn not only to history, to archaeology, to science, and also to the Word of God to see what is available to us today. Now, most of the information we have concerning blood covenants is actually initially was passed down from father to son and from son to grandson and so on down through the centuries. And of course there's some inherent problems with information that's passed on from father to son down through centuries, and that is that we all know that information passed on by word of mouth over time kind of gets changed and lost. We've all been subject to Chinese whispers, and we've all been subject to rumors that change. Now, having said that, for a very long time, passing information from father to son was the only means of communicating information. And so in our ancient past, that information passed from father to son had to be passed and understood literally. It had to be very, very clear, so that at least initially in those first few hundred years, until such time as there was written information, written in records, that the information would be passed on accurately. Nonetheless, we still don't tend to consider such information as so terribly reliable. It tends to be considered as anecdotal, which is really helpful to us in some ways and not so helpful in others. Now, we are very fortunate that some of the ancient covenants that were passed down from the Middle and Near Eastern countries were actually written in stone and on clay tablets, and some of these go back more than 2,000 years before Christ, which makes them over 4,000 years old historically. And there are plenty of examples of these: the Esarhaddon treatise, the Hittite treatise, the treatise of the Aramaean treatise of Sephir, and so on. And these all speak about, not only, but include blood covenants. They tell us all about the society of the time, and in these treaties you will find references to and descriptions of blood covenant. Not only do we have them in these, but we also have them in something called the Mari tablets. Now, the Mari tablets were a collection of tablets that were found they were found a few hundred years ago, and they speak to us of the life and times more than 2,000 years before Christ also. Now, I want us to focus on this little bit here. The Mari tablets were dated in the 2nd millennium BC. More important than that was a discovery of a treaty between Ramses II and Hattusilus III of the Hittite Empire. Ramses II was Ramses the Great. He was the most powerful, allegedly, of all of the Egyptian pharaohs, and he was admired for so much. But he did enter into a war with Hattusilus II of the Hittite Empire. Now, the problem is that these two great kings, they were great kings with huge armies, and they would fight for decades. They were fighting backwards and forwards, and neither side winning the battle for any length of time. Eventually they came to an agreement. That agreement was to be a blood covenant, and that was going to be written in stone, and it was going to be written on silver trays, and it was to be preserved for all time. We still have records of these in our museums, so you can find out for yourself. Go on the internet, search Dr. Google, and you'll find lots of information concerning Ramses II and Hattusilus III. Very important characters for our blood covenant discussion. Just to give you a little bit of an idea, here's a couple of reliefs, one of Ramses II on the left of your screen, and on the right there's the relief of Hattusilus III. Now, I mentioned a few moments ago the Mari tablets, and these looked like this. They were clay tablets, and they were found a couple of hundred years ago now, and these discussed the life, the times, the laws, and the society around about 2,000 years before Christ. Interesting thing, the Mari tablets actually refer to Abraham and some of his family members. Now, the point of bringing these up and to show you these is to show you that these are actual things that you can find. These items can be found, or copies of these items can be found in your local museum, pretty much no matter where you are. That's how valuable these are seen as being. The covenant between Ramses II and Hattusilus III is particularly important because the covenant between them was preserved in stone and in silver trays. They're preserved until today, and they are the most detailed description that we have anywhere on the planet of blood covenant, of its laws and of its ceremonial rites. The laws and ceremony of blood covenant written between Hattusilus II and Ramses III are incredibly similar to the blood covenant as we find in the Bible. I am not going to enter into an argument as to which came first. It's kind of like saying which came first, the chicken or the egg. Here's the facts. We have a blood covenant, a secular blood covenant, which is written, that is identical to the blood covenants which we find throughout the Bible. And the whole point of that is to show you what God intended when he wrote the blood covenant, beginning as far back as Noah, certainly enshrined, Adam, certainly enshrined with Abraham, and reinforced throughout the New Testament. We will see all of these as we go through. The first thing to consider with this, however, as we read through this, is the blood covenant contract. We're about to have a look at the blood covenant contract. You will see echoes of the Word of God as you go through this. It's a fascinating and a wonderful piece of information that we need to get hold of. Now, this is a a vassal covenant contract that we're going to look at, even though the actual contract that this is all modelled on is the same as the blood covenant contract between Hattusilus and Ramses. So, first of all, there's an introduction of the great king, with all of his titles and attributes. And remember that the vassal covenant is between a great king and a lesser king, where the conquering king takes the lesser king and conquers him and offers him a way out from destruction. So first of all, there's an introduction of the great king with all his titles and attributes. The great king may have many vassal kings, but the vassal king can only have one great king. There is to be a prohibition of any formal relationships between the vassals and any other kings outside of the sphere of the great king's allies. There's the prohibition of hostilities between any of the vassal kings between each other. If they're in covenant relationship with the great king, they're not allowed to be at war with each other. The vassal must provide immediate assistance to the great king or to any of the other vassals he's in treaty with in times of war or distress. The vassal must not listen to or give any credence to any slandering of the great king, and he must report such slander immediately. The vassal must not hide, nor may any of his people hide any refugees or slaves of the great king. Once a year, the vassal must appear before the great king to pay his taxes and to renew his treaty. 2 copies of the treaty are to be written. One is kept in the footstool of the great king, the other is kept in the vassal's temple. It must be read by the vassal and his people at least once per year. A list of gods and goddesses were drawn up, and they were called on to witness the covenant. The sun, the moon, the stars, whatever they would worship were to be called upon. But here's the thing. The gods of the great king were to become the gods of the vassal king. He was not allowed to accept his own kings any longer, and the great king's gods must become in preference to his own gods. And if there were to be any argument on the issue, let's face it, you pray to your God for salvation, your God doesn't protect you, the great king comes, threatens you, is about to, his God must have been a better God than your God. So you tend to accept the gods of the great king. That was the way it worked. The vassal is to be assured of support in times of war or attack by any enemy, and the benefit of any technological change or progress was to be made and passed on to the vassal king. A list of blessings were included that were bestowed upon the vassal king, provided that he maintained his part of the covenant. These blessings included the perpetuity of his kingdom, wealth, peace, national prosperity, no matter what else happened. Keep the covenant and all these good things will happen. But there's a rub, because at the very end of the covenant, at the very end of the covenant contract, was a clause that said that if either side were to break the covenant, then they would be cursed. And the actual statement given to the end of this covenant contract during the ceremony was, and so shall it be to you as it was to this beast, a beast that had been slain on behalf of both of them. Should you break the covenant, dreadful things will happen. Now, that's just a very brief list of the contract. Now, we're going to go into some detail a little bit later on as we go through the study and deal with each aspect of the ceremony itself. You can always go back and have a look at that if you feel you need to. But for now, what we're going to have a look at is a little bit more of the covenant ceremony. It's important to understand that once we've entered into this blood covenant, we can't get out of it. We're stuck with it. There are consequences. We can walk away, but there's a dreadful price to be paid for doing so. And the price paid is part of the covenant itself. So even in the destruction of one family or the other, which would bring about an end to the covenant, that destruction is a part of the blood covenant law. So you really can't get out of it. Once entered into it, there is no turning back. It's important to understand and realize that both parties enter into this blood covenant willingly, of their own volition, understanding the consequences. These rules and laws of the covenant are going to be read out to both kings publicly before they step into the actual covenant ceremony itself. They will also be repeated during the ceremony. Now it's the covenant ceremony that we're going to have a look at next. So going through this covenant ceremony, it would incorporate all of these parts. First of all, there has to be a mutual desire on both parties to agree together on the concept of a covenant. This must be mutual. It's going to be binding on both parts. Now, I suppose it's a bit questionable as to how mutual it is when you're facing death and destruction if you don't agree. But nonetheless, that was the way that it was seen. Once the agreement was reached, the terms of the covenant are publicly outlined by both parties to both parties. The great king's scribes draw up the contract as it is agreed upon. Now, next thing that happens, there's going to be an exchange of armor and weapons by the covenant partner, and typically this is only going to be from the great king to the vassal, but occasionally the vassal king would also offer the great king a gift in the same areas. There's particular meaning given to these, and we'll be looking at the meanings later, but for now I just want to try and get through this historical part of the whole deal. There is quite a range of exchanges. There's an exchange of clothing, again typically from the great king to the vassal. After this comes the reading of the covenant laws and its terms of reference. After the reading came the sacrifice of the substitute animal. We'll touch briefly on some of this sacrifice at this point. So in coming together, the covenant, in a covenant, the two heads have quite literally agreed to die to themselves and to live for each other. Now there's no point in the two kings literally dying, because then there would be no covenant. So the animal is going to be cut in half from top to bottom whilst it's still alive. The sacrificial animal usually took the form of a bull or a cow, but it could be any form of domesticated animal. The two kings are then going to stand in between the two halves of the animal, which has been cut in half literally and laid down on the ground with its skin on the ground and its innards exposed to the air, and they're going to stand between the two parts, and they will walk around the animal in a figure 8. And as they begin to walk around the animal in the figure 8, the first half of the figure 8, they will begin to pronounce blessings upon each other as they progress around the first half of the figure 8. Each of them is trying to outdo the other in the blessings. Now this is important. Although they are trying to outdo each other, they are very sincere. This is a covenant agreement. It is binding on them. So they're going to be speaking such blessings as the perpetuity of their kingdom, the expansion of their kingdom, that their wives and their families will be healthy and they will have plenty of children, that their farms and their lands will be fertile, and there will be no wild animals attacking their lands. They'll be protected, and so on and so forth. All those kinds of wonderful things that we would genuinely like to see happening to another people. Now when the two kings get together in the middle of the animal, they begin to change tone. Now they're going to provide curses. As long as they are in covenant, those blessings are being offered to them. Now they begin to issue curses, and those curses are going to be the destruction of their families, plague, animals, wild animals taking over the land, the destruction of property, and so on and so forth. Finally ending as the two kings stand together. And all of those curses are there should either of them choose to leave the covenant, and this is the penalty of doing so. And so they stand facing each other finally in the middle of the blood covenant, in the middle of the animal, and they will make a pronunciation to each other. They will say, "So shall it be done to you as it was to this beast, if you should break this covenant." This was seen as a particularly sacred time. There's a whole lot of stuff is involved in all of this, and we will be going into it in quite some detail as we go through the course. So the kings are going to be called on to witness this covenant which has just taken place between the two. And now at the conclusion of the ceremony, there's going to be a ceremonial feast. Oh, I should point something out, just going back a little bit. Towards the end of this ceremony, there's going to be a cutting of the flesh of the two kings and a joining together of the wound between them, symbolic of the animal that has been slain for them. So after this, there's going to be a covenant feast, and this is going to be a magnificent ceremony which is going to go on for days, sometimes weeks, as the kings come into a celebration. It's important to understand something. At this point, the two tribes, kings, nations, whatever they may be, are going to come together and celebrate the fact that they're having peace. So there's all of the animosity between them is going to be put behind them. They're going to see each other as bosom buddies from this point forward. It's fabulously significant for us to understand some of this. Now, as they do all of this, and they're coming into this feast, at a particular time during the feast, there's going to be a pause. And the two kings are going to come together, and they're going to take a cup, and they're going to take some of the blood of the animal which has been kept by the priest who killed the animal. He's kept some of the blood in a cup, and they're going to take some of the bread. They're going to take some of the flesh of the animal. Now, there are variations on how this is going to work, and again we'll explore it a bit later. But they'll drink the blood, they'll eat the flesh of the animal, and they're going to make a declaration that they are now living for each other and for the benefit of each other. At some time during the feast, there's going to be an exchange of names. Very often the great king would give the vassal king a new name. That is the name by which he will be known, and the vassal king will get to know his new king by a new name too. So this exchange takes place a little bit like a marriage in a sense, and again that is a form of blood covenant that we will discuss later. Now finally, there's the seal of the covenant. A seal is going to be a personal seal, and there's going to be a public seal. The personal seal, if it hasn't already occurred, as very often did, it would be a cutting of the flesh of the two kings, usually on the forearm, and as they would cut the forearm, they would bind the forearms together in a particular way so that it would leave a very specific scar, and there's a reason for that very specific scar. The second seal is going to be a gift which is given by the great king to the vassal king, which is to be a permanent reminder. It may come in the form of a tree, it may come in the form of a mountain or a river, it might be in the form of a herd of sheep or goats, but it's going to be something which is expected to last forever. And as long as that tree, that river flows, the mountain is there, the flock of sheep or goats continues to grow, then so should the blood covenant continue. It was to be a permanent reminder, not only to the kings, but also to all of the people in the two tribes of the great king. Not only the great king, but also the lesser king, the vassal king. Nothing could be more binding on a nation or more positive for them than for a king to be in a covenant relationship with a great king. It was something which is going to provide security for both of the nations as long as they were to live. It would bring peace and prosperity and rejoicing for everyone. And it was something which was real, and it is embedded in our history. No matter how far back you go, no matter where you look, you will find blood covenant in your ancient past. What is remarkable to us is that God has chosen to deal with us through the same avenue that he chose, that men and women chose to deal with each other. Personally, I believe that blood covenant was started by God. I believe that because there's evidence of blood covenant between God and man long before there was evidence of blood covenant between men and men. But that's not the issue. The issue is that there is a blood covenant law a blood covenant ceremony which can be found through the Bible, something which is able to give us an assurance as to how God is going to deal with us and how we should deal with God. And yet you and I entered into a relationship with God without knowing about it. We entered into a blood covenant relationship ignorant of the facts. The sad truth is that, ignorant or not, the consequences of failing our part in blood covenant brings about dire consequences, and the blessings of following blood covenant brings about tremendous blessings to us. But we tend to stumble through because nobody's telling us about this. And that's part of what I want to be able to do for you, to show you the great rights and responsibilities that you and I have before God based on his blood covenant. As I did my research and study over the years, the more I studied blood covenants, the more in the secular blood covenants and in the Word of God, the more I began to realize that that was something that God was interested in us understanding. This is an introductory lesson, but I want you to remember something. There's a blood covenant between God and man. It was really first formalized between God and Abraham. Now, yes, there's blood covenant evidence in the Garden of Eden. Yes, there's covenant relationship referred to with Noah. But the blood covenant relationship, which is given to us in the most detail, is found in Genesis chapter 12 and 15. And they're remarkably similar to the blood covenant that you will find between Hattusilus and Ramses. God the Father is the great king. He's our great king. Blood covenant made us kings and priests with God. We are vassal covenants. And here's the great promise of blood covenant. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, "Do not fear, Abram. I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great." That is the first verse of the blood covenant promise and ceremony related between God and Abraham. According to the word of God, you and I, as Christians, are children of Abraham, and the blood covenant promises go on from Abraham to the Jewish nation, down through the centuries to every single Christian everywhere on the planet, and that you and I are entitled to enter into some of the most fabulous promises you could ever imagine. So till next time, I'm Pastor Denis Plant, and I just wish you every possible blessing as you begin to enter into this study on the blood covenant. God bless you.